Our speaker today obviously is popular because there's no parking when I got here. Our speaker today is probably the most quoted political analyst in Florida, and has been for years. It got to the point when I was the state editor of the St. Pete Times, the executive editor said, "No more Susan MacManus. You got to find somebody else to quote." But the problem was, there are not very many political scientists who actually study Florida politics and know what they're talking about and bring the receipts and the numbers. And so what you're going to hear today is facts. And the other great thing about Susan MacManus is she was raised by a Democrat and a Republican, and she's about as nonpartisan as you can get. Isn't it great we have Democrats and Republicans today sitting down together? Us understand what's going on in these upcoming elections and what's happened to the Florida voters, the demographics, and what about these independents? Why can't they make up their mind? So everyone, please welcome Susan MacManus.
Thank you very much. I live in Pasco, so I've been up since 5 to make sure I didn't miss this morning, so thank you for coming. Well, Florida has really changed a lot, and people often really don't focus in on why our state's politics is changing so much. And a lot of it requires some really deep analysis. Probably some of the biggest changes that we've seen in our state have been obviously in party identification. I'll get to that in some more detail. But in terms of the demographics, which I focus on mostly, there's been a tremendous change in the racial and ethnic makeup of our state. Also the gender differential in who's participating in politics, but probably the biggest change has been in the generational makeup of Florida. So we'll start probably first with some things that are critical. Certainly the state is trending more Republican in registration, but the fastest growing upswing is in no party affiliation and third parties. And we are a trendsetter. If you haven't read Philip Bump's book called The Aftermath, he's a Washington Post reporter, that book points to Florida as, and I agree with him, the demographics in Florida today are where the nation is going to be in 2050. And it's particularly true in some of the things that we're going to talk about. But nothing changed our state more than COVID and in-migration. I told my students for years, you can't even take demographics from 2 years prior in our state in certain counties and be confident you can run an election to win the next year. But during the pandemic, I just give you some interesting stats here. We had about 400,000 new voters come in just the COVID time period, which was 3% of the registrants in 2022 were not here in 2020, gives you an idea of the magnitude. Of those that moved in during the pandemic, 46% registered as Republicans, 29% as independents, and 23% as Democrats. And it's important to understand people moving in here were not just old, rich Republicans from the Northeast. There was that kind of imagery going around. A lot of the people who moved into Florida during that time period were younger voters. Younger voters are registering as no party affiliation. It was also people with families that didn't want their kids locked down. They wanted them to go to school. So there was a lot of different demographics that were pushing this change in the composition of our state. So obviously our party affiliation now, what we've seen over the since 2020, is a 6% drop in registered Democrats in Florida. And we've also seen, again, an increase in NPAs, but Democrats have suffered the most. Let's look at race and ethnicity. Florida has the most diverse population of color of any of the 50 states. Hispanics make up around 18% of our registrants. That's gone up incrementally. Blacks, 13%. That's been steady since 2012. And Asians going up slightly, but what's also increased is the number of people who are biracial or multiracial. A lot of younger people would be in that particular category. But if we take a look at within each party, the shifts that have taken place in the percent registrants of different racial and ethnic groups just since 2020, and by the way, the data that I'm quoting right now for 2024, it was as of January 1, is the most current available, so you're getting where we are right now. Let's take, first of all, the Democrats. Democrats since 2020 in Florida, this is statewide, have lost 3% of the white vote of the registrants, 5% of black vote, 6% of Hispanic vote, 3% of Asians, and that is kind of an indication that this is across a lot of different groups that Republicans are making gains. And let's look at the Republican side of it. 3% gain in whites in Florida registrants, 1% in blacks, Hispanics 5% increase for Republicans, Asians 3%, and the NPA's marginal gain, but the other parties, the minor parties, each group, there was 1% that moved to that. By the way, there's a lot of discussion these days about third parties, and everybody wants a different party. National polls show that 60-some% are willing to vote for an independent or not one of the major party candidates. And that is a trend that we see across the country as well. There's more and more people turning their backs on the two major parties, particularly the young. In terms of the generational stuff, this is the most important thing I'm going to talk to you about. Even now, I'll get a call from an out-of-state person that wants to come to Florida to do interviews, and they'll say to me, I'd like to come interview some older people. Do you think you can find a group for me? Well, I said you can start with me, but no, I'm just kidding. The problem with that is that 57%, and this is an 8% increase in just a few years, 57% of Florida's current registrants are the three youngest generations. The millennials and the Gen Zers are over a third now. This is called generational replacement. It's something a lot of people don't pay attention to, but as you get older, you tend to die as you reach a certain age. And the younger generation is very different. And let me tell you, we have been talking about, Tom knows this, about the coming generational splits in America. We are seeing it vividly in this state right now. A plurality of Florida's Gen Zers and millennials are registered as no party affiliation. You can't reach them in the traditional ways that you and I are used to having politics too. They think neither party is worth their time. So how do you reach them? Well, we know from some research that we've done on generations, it's one of my favorite things to look at. There are a couple things about the younger generations that are different. They are not party-centric. They are issue-centric. You can only reach them through getting to their issues. So we often say that the three things a candidate has to have to really grab a young person's attention and possibly motivate them to vote. The three things are, first of all, inspiration. It has to be an inspirational candidate. Number two, it has to be someone who speaks directly to their issues in a non-condescending manner. And number three, they value diversity. What's really interesting about Florida is the youngest generation, Gen Z, is already, these are registrants, already a majority non-white. There's an intersection between race and so forth. Now, we haven't said much about women, but there's some really interesting things going on in Florida on this one as well. This latest data that we got from the state, and it's been inching up, the percentage of women versus men registered statewide in Florida right now is 6%. 6% more of all registrants in Florida are female. 2% are turning their back on the traditional definitions of gender. In other words, this is where other states have recognized non-binary definitions of gender, but not Florida. But it's 2%, and that is, of course, a little bit higher among younger voters. But what is fascinating is if you look at the gender breakdown within the parties. First of all, there's very little difference in the percentage of women Democrats and Republicans overall. It's almost equal, as a matter of fact. But within the parties themselves, listen to this one. Within Florida Democrats, 21% more women than men are registered. And within women of color, the gap is huge between registered women of color and men of color. This is why we see in terms of candidacy rates, we looked at it the last election cycle, you see so many more younger women of color Democrats making a run. And what they'll tell you, because we've interviewed them, they're not waiting on the party to recruit. They have a message and they don't care if they win or lose, but they want to make a statement. Both parties, because they're slipping relative to NPAs, plurality of the younger or NPAs, realize that they got to start thinking about this generational replacement. So these are some of the real big changes demographically that I see, but I would be remiss in light of where we are at the moment in the election if I didn't talk a little bit about the mood of the public right now about politics. It's not good. There's massive voter fatigue. And I grabbed a bunch of the surveys that are just out right recently. This is national now, a little bit. 67% don't think the country's headed in the right direction. When asked about how they feel, to use a word, about politics, 65% say they're exhausted, 55% they're angry, 20% hopeful, and only 4% excited. The challenge that's very much a big one is this kind of imagery. People's views on politics are based on national politics, not state and local. But my fear is that this, and I'm going to quote a couple more here, my fear is that state and local candidates are going to have the toughest time ever in breaking through this disgust about politics in this country. Just to continue, for almost a year now, 60 to 70% have said they do not want a Biden-Trump rematch. Just this week, a Reuters poll came out, 70% of Democrats don't want Biden to run, and over half the Republicans don't want Trump to run. This is where we're at. So what does that do in turnout? We haven't a clue. Who's going to stay home? And each party has gaping holes in terms of who supports them that might stay home. I really think, and then I'll close with one more after this, one statement, but basically we have 4 parties in America these days. Within the Democrats we have 2. We have the centrists and we have the progressives, never the twain shall meet, generational. And among the Republicans we have the MAGA and the traditionalists, generation again. And so each side has a part of their electorate that just may not vote at all. Now let me continue. Everybody's talking about the threat to democracy. Here was a question asked. Do you agree or disagree? National division is a threat to our democracy. 72% agreed across both parties. Will democracy in America continue in the next 10 years? Yes, 36%. And Each party sees the other as the biggest threat. 75% of Democrats see Republicans as the biggest threat to democracy, and the same is true on the other side. Republicans see Democrats. And what this spells, and it adds up to what I'm kind of alluding to here, is the biggest changes in people's, how they look at our two-party system. And that's what's really being eroded. Nationally, in the Gallup poll, the ones just released, 41% of Americans now say that they are an independent. And again, a lot of that is generational. So the politics, they are a-changing. And even if you look at Iowa and New Hampshire, what did we see there that the press really didn't elevate like it should to me? Low turnout in both of them. Polls wrong in both of them. So that is my look at this year's election. I hope you had a good breakfast and you leave here with a good mood after this commentary.